thank you so much for joining us today. Without any delay, I would like to quickly begin the session for which you all are waiting for. I'm Sudhir Pandey and I welcome you to Ahmedabad University. This is the famous conversation series. I request those people, I can see there are one or two people who are joining with their mobile and your mobile name or something else is showing up. So I request you to rename yourself. And the reason is that we like our audience to ask questions to our expert speakers. And in that process, we request you to put your questions in the chat box, everybody's chat box, where your name and the question shows up. And then we take the question and then we put all the questions at the end of the conversation, which generally goes for 55 to 60 minutes. So that will be really helpful for us. So please do that. It is my pleasure to introduce today's panel. It is a very interesting panel, a management school hosting a conversation on Indian middle class. And there are two people, one is from anthropology and one professor from marketing talking about it. I mean, there is nothing more exciting than this on today's evening. So our guest today is Dr. Michiel Baas, and he's a senior research fellow with the Max Planck Institute in Halle, Germany, and lecturer with the Institute of Interdisciplinary Studies of the University of Amsterdam. He holds a PhD in anthropology of the University of Amsterdam and has published extensively on the Indian middle class, Indian migration to Australia and Singapore, the functioning of the student-led migration industry, and the Indian IT industry. He has been associated with the National University of Singapore and the Nalanda University, and he has recently published a very readable, very nice book, which is talking about exactly the Indian middle class and how the other classes are trying to get into that middle class, where he talks about the gymming industry and the coffee barista people, those who work there come from rural areas. So he has a very interesting perspective to give today. And we welcome you, Michiel, to Ahmedabad University. Thank you so much for joining us. The person who will be in conversation with Michiel will be our own Professor Bijal Mehta. She is a professor from marketing area, and she has been in academics for almost a decade, more than a decade. Before coming to academics, she has a very interesting background. She worked in the industry, in knowledge management, training development, and business management, and then she came to academics. Her primary research areas are marketing communication, entrepreneurship, and services in financial services, tourism, hospitality services, heritage management, and marketing on digital and social media. And she teaches one of the famous courses at Ahmedabad University, which is digital marketing, courses on digital marketing and social media management. And she's very much interested in qualitative research methodology. And she has been associated with several institutes like Judge Business School in Cambridge, and then at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. I welcome both of you, and now I request you to begin the conversation without further delay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sudhir.
Thank you. Yeah.
So welcome, Michiel. Welcome to Ahmedabad University and to this conversation series. I once again want to say we are very happy to have you here, and all of us are very excited to actually hear from you about all the things that we have read about, and more importantly, something that is very evident that you feel very, very passionate about, which is India and the way India functions, the different classes that are there at India, and the uniqueness, I would say, that this diverse country has. So I'm looking forward to this conversation with you today. And so let me quickly get into the discussion. First, would you please tell us about how did your interest in India start? You seem to be a very keen observer of this, part of this country and all the excitement that it creates. So if you can somewhere start with that, yes.
So I think my interest in India goes back quite a long way, and actually started with Hinduism and the Mahabharata, which I think probably that interest is something like 25, maybe even 30 years old. But it was really around the turn of the century with the new millennium that I became interested in what people meant by the idea of a new India or a modern India. You might recall 1997, which is a very important year for India because India celebrated 50 years of independence.
Yes.
And at the time, living in the Netherlands and working in a bookshop, I would constantly come across all these magazines discussing how India had changed post-independence. And I thought that was really fascinating because they all had a way of conceptualizing this alongside the axis of, at some point there was a more traditional India and now there was a modern India. And they did so using pictures of Gandhi, of the Nehru era, and juxtaposing that with impressions of Bangalore, with its emerging IT industry. And it really started sort of, it evoked a question in me, is like, how's that change actually experienced? How do people relate to those kind of developments? And are they actually as stark as these magazines would depict them? And these are, kind of Newsweek, Business Week, The Economist, all of them were doing that at a time. And actually Indian magazines like India Today and Outlook India were doing the same. So all of them had this idea of India becoming new and becoming modern. 20 years later, you see that actually not much has changed. We're still talking about this. We're still thinking that, this is now the modern India. This is now the India that is changing rapidly. But if you look from my perspective, and I've been looking into this for about 2 decades now, is that at least within these 2 decades, the topic of a rapidly changing India has never been off the agenda of any scholar or journalist working on India.
Interesting. So I particularly like the fact that you've said that every couple of years or every time that there is a discussion, the general conversation is, this is the new India, this is what it is. But actually, if you observe, India is constantly changing.
Yeah.
And because it is changing at a very fast pace, and maybe that is the reason why one always feels, as if it's something different, something new, which has already happened. But actually, I think this country is one most classic example of, change being the only constant all the time.
I think you're absolutely right about that. The late Professor Mario Rutte, who was actually my PhD supervisor many years ago, once said to me, he said, people are always saying that India is changing now, but he had been looking into Gujarat specifically, for I think about 30 years. And he said, I've never seen that idea of change not being on the table. People are always experiencing that this was the moment and the time to look into India. Maybe indeed, like you said, this is the one constant factor, change. And he would certainly agree with you, as some of the people who've joined in might actually remember his work on Gujarat, rather extensively on rural classes making their way into industrial production. And he focused his research very much on I'm thinking of the town. It will come to me in a second. But in any case, the topic of change is at the heart of my own research and my own writing.
Right. So would you want to tell us a little more on that in terms of the kind of anthropological research that you've been doing about India, or the developments that are taking place, the kind of class developments that you so frequently mention in your smaller articles, as well as, of course, in the book that you have recently written with a focus on the gym trainers and the fitness enthusiasts. So probably if we can get into that anthropological research side of you discovering more about India.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be keen to get into that. And this is quite a number of years ago, when I lived in Bangalore and would regularly interact with IT professionals. One of the things that I thought was very interesting was how people coming from English-speaking upper middle class backgrounds would kind of relate to and reflect on people who they considered new middle class backgrounds, often of vernacular speaking backgrounds, not necessarily being very fluent in English, not necessarily being from the biggest cities, having gone through a process of internal migration, migrating from smaller towns, whether that be Karnataka or Dissa or elsewhere, to bigger cities, and then making their way into middle class ranks. And I remember very well from my research among IT professionals that there was always this sense of one group knowing what it meant to be middle class and reflecting on another group who were clearly thought to be new there. And as an anthropologist, I found that fascinating, because what you see there is that these things rely not so much on factual knowledge, but more of a social and cultural interpretation. And one of the arguments I make in my book is that the middle class category itself, in that sense, is very much a social and a cultural category, not so much a factual category. We don't really know. I mean, Sudhir just led this really wonderful kind of sort of quick assessments of what people think,
Yes.
how large the middle class is, whether or not they themselves think of being middle class. Of course, within marketing studies, what you see is that people want to sort of boil this down to figures. And this leads to marketing reports. And I myself have a background in management. I have a degree in international management, so I know how that works. We want to have this in front of us on a piece of paper, and we want to know, well, 30% of India can be considered middle class, and we can sell products to this middle class. But from an anthropological perspective, you see that these things kind of unravel very quickly. They don't mean all that much. It's very much about how people interpret their own position vis-a-vis somebody else. And they don't just do that on the basis of economics. They also do that on the basis of connection, on comportment, how you dress, how you behave, how you speak to each other. So it's a very sort of complex mixture. And for that, you really need to let go, basically, of factual numbers and economics to understand what middle classness entails, and also how it relates to, for instance, consumer behavior.
Right, absolutely. I think we have just gone through the Diwali festival, the Indian New Year festival, a few days back, just about last week. And I think there is no better example or no better time to really observe the way classes operate or lifestyles operate in this country. Obviously, this year has been slightly different because of the pandemic that all of us are going through. Otherwise, every year, these festivals, and particularly the Diwali festival, is the time that you actually get to observe all the classes, across the board celebrating, but celebrating in different ways. And I think that's where one realizes, again, I'm saying this purely from my own observations of, while being out there celebrating along with everybody else, that it's not just one, even within a middle class, if we talk about it, it's not just one middle class, there are classes within the class itself.
Yes.
So the general perception is that probably middle classes may be more urban in nature, maybe a little more modern than perhaps some other rural areas and so on. But come to think of it today, the kind of dilution which is taking place because of mobility possibilities, because of movement possibilities, because of the job prospects or opportunities, I think that change has definitely taken place. So would you want to sort of maybe share your own views on that, on this class within the class? How does it operate, the difference in cultures, but still similarities as well?
Yeah. Well, a good example is really the poll that we just saw, where people are asked to assess whether or not they themselves would label themselves as middle class, and what the imagined size of the Indian middle class is. And so to bring back this question to the first example, what you see is that people label themselves middle class within a particular context. So obviously we've all come together here on Zoom using a particular medium that is not accessible to all. Furthermore, we're doing this conversation in English, obviously because the school at Ahmedabad University does most of its teaching in English, but English itself is already a qualifier of middle class belonging, and more specifically, that kind of fluency that is required for this conversation is usually points at an upper middle class background. But obviously not all people who have come together here might think of themselves as upper middle class, because maybe they think like, well, that doesn't resonate with the way I experience my own economic background, the kind of background my parents had in terms of money to be spent. But already there you see a certain complexity in middle class belonging, which is not just about economics. You might recall from my book, I talk about particular caste groups in the NCR region who've been incredibly upwardly mobile in terms of economics because they hold very valuable land, which is swallowed up by new expansion. Where on the one hand, if you compare them to, for instance, South Delhiites, in terms of economics, they certainly rival these groups. They GK1 and GK2, which are typically seen as upper middle class, sort of people with landed property, with a long history of being middle classness. Right. So if you compare them to, for instance, Jat and Gujar groups in the NCR region, economically, they are fairly competitive, but not when it comes to social and cultural capital. This is where they lag behind. And obviously, English language is already a key ingredient in that, but it goes further than that. It has to do with education. It has to do with also being used to being middle class, of belonging. And from an anthropological perspective, these are the things that we are interested in. How do people actually navigate and negotiate these subject positions, as we call them? Right. And you see the same happening really in the second survey, where people are asked to assess how big the middle class really is within India. As I show in the book as well, for roughly 25 years, the argument has been around that this middle class is 300 million Indians large. Right. And strikingly, this number hasn't changed all that much in the past decades. And that is partly because we find it hard to count numbers. I mean, how do you do that? But it also has to do with that these internal boundaries also make that we don't really want to admit that it might be bigger or smaller. So the middle class is one that exists mainly in the heads of people, instead of that it actually exists on paper as a fixed number.
Right. Does the middle class, do you think there is a possibility to really migrate from another class into the middle class in some way? Is it really possible to, if a divide at all does exist, is it really possible to reduce that divide in some way? Or is that divide already reducing? And if it's yes, then how is it reducing?
So the men I look into in the book are fitness trainers who partly use their own bodily capital to negotiate that trajectory. So what they have to offer is a body that other people are after. So upper middle class clients come to the gym with the idea in mind that they want to look like these trainers. They don't want to be the trainers. They want to have the same kind of body. What trainers offer is that kind of potential for transformation. So what they bring to the table in that sense is bodily capital. They might be hailing from lower middle class or new middle class vernacular backgrounds. They might not have all the comportment and middle class belonging in place. But of course, they have something else to offer to the table. And what you see increasingly, and I think this is where it really gets interesting, is people, new entrants to the middle class, finding creative way of climbing up the middle class ladder by other means than just education, which in the past was, of course, always thought to be the key thing. You know, if you wanted to grow in life, if you wanted to become upper middle class, upwardly mobile, it was always education, education, education. But what we see in India is that has changed in recent years, partly because people have been disappointed in what they get out of education. There've been quite a few very interesting studies about this. For Time Pass by what's his name is a very famous study there that kind of shows that education indeed doesn't offer all the answers. But increasingly, what I find fascinating is how people bypass these education trajectories and through creative ways muscle their way into middle class ranks. But coming back to your question, like, is it always possible? No, it's a very long trajectory. And I think this is where we see that all this rapid change can be quite slow in reality as well. It takes perseverance. It takes a very long time to work yourself up and then to confidently declare your position within middle class ranks. And this, of course, has to do with the generational history we see in a lot of middle class families where, and this might be the case for your own family, perhaps your parents already were educators or spoke English at home, perhaps even your grandparents did. The men that I focus in this book don't have that advantage. They are newcomers to all of this. They're self-made men. They don't all of this is new to them. So they're self-made men. They have to invent themselves. They can't rely on their parents' knowledge. Their parents are often quite bewildered by the trajectories they've chosen. And I think this is what makes that group very interesting. And I do believe it's a rapidly growing group, but it's hard to put a number on it.
Oh, no, certainly. It is indeed hard to put a number on it, although there are income brackets given, there are population brackets given, saying from X population, say 300 million, as you have pointed out, and about anywhere between 35 to 40%. But we do know that when we talk about it in terms of, say, lifestyle or culture, or even the rising expectations, again, these rising expectations, I think they also come from the kind of exposure that technology and media offers today, to irrespective of whichever corner of the country one might be in. And I think I would also sort of give a lot of some part of credit of that to the development in the telecom facilities as well. Today, it's very, very easy to have a smartphone. Let's say it's not difficult to have a well-connected smartphone in most parts of the country and for a large strata of the society of people. And I think when you get exposed at a very young age, naturally, then the expectations or the desires to scale up, to start belonging, definitely they are going to increase.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other side is also, obviously, this has also given rise to the different kinds of job opportunities. So I'm kind of connecting it to the poll response that we got, where the question was about how do you think the rise in the middle class has happened? And many of our participants agreed that it was because of maybe the service-driven possibilities which are existing in the economy or in the jobs and so on and so forth. And a lot of the workforce that we see today, even outside, the young workforce, the part-time workforce, which is working for the coffee shops or the fast food chains or the restaurants, they are aspiring to be educated perhaps, but at the moment they are still trying to sort of start earning, start doing different things and start belonging through ways other than just education.
Yeah.
So I think that, yes, definitely it is a very, very evident observation in the way things are moving in India. My question to you on that note would then have to be that what kind of expectations do you think the Indian middle class today has from the jobs or from their employers or from the society? Those who have just moved into the class, so to say, and I think that is all because that is also the sector that you are focusing or looking at actively.
Yeah.
So what do they expect? What do they want?
So beyond the book that I just wrote, which focuses almost entirely on fitness and personal trainers, I also did research among coffee baristas working for Starbucks and people working for high-end malls, specifically the kind of shops of high-end brands. And I think one of the sort of the commonalities among these different groups is that they all are looking for an opportunity to learn in very practical terms. And this learning isn't just about the brand that they're selling or the service they're selling, but also to learn from their customers. And I think that's a very new development in India. In fact, if I may give an example, in Starbucks, for instance, when Starbucks was just launched in India, I did a project among a couple of Starbucks employees, all working in one of the earlier ones in Delhi. And one thing that I found so striking was that even though their salaries weren't particularly high, they all took great pride in working for Starbucks because of the way the company was investing in their capacities to deliver a particular service. And they saw that as a way up. So if you were able to grow within Starbucks ranks, then you might move on to a 5-star hotel. And it was particularly the company that offered a much more concrete learning platform than a course would. So they'd all gone to university or to college. They all tried that, but hadn't learned all that much. I mean, that was their assessment of it. Whereas when they spoke about working for Starbucks or working for high-end fitness chains, what they appreciated was the very concrete merit-oriented coursework they'd be made to do. In Starbucks, for instance, they were always allowed to study within Starbucks. So they didn't need to go to the kitchen to look through their coursework, as they called it. No, they were learning within Starbucks itself. And I think this group in particular, that's what they're looking for, because they've often been disappointed with education otherwise, or they felt left out, and suddenly they feel recognized for their potential. And I think this is a very hungry group. They're willing to make something. They see around them all the opportunities that whatever this new India is might offer them: mushrooming shopping malls, multiplexes, and all these kind of things. So they're making their way in that. They're the new service professionals, and so learning is really key in that, and that's what they're seeking in that, because the opportunities are otherwise quite limited in more traditional businesses. So that would be part of my answer. That's what this generation of youngsters, new entrants to the middle class, look for.
How about the monetary expectations versus the learning expectations? Because they are somewhere non-comparable, I would say.
Yeah.
From being an academic, I would think probably learning is the most important, but then one would also think about it in terms of, to make a living, one has to also think of the monetary compensation. So do they have different expectations there, or do they come, especially the class which has just migrated and just still trying to fit in? Have you had any observations in terms of whether they're okay to settle in with a little less monetary compensation, or they want to compete equally with those who are already here and have been there for a while?
Well, this is obviously a very complex thing to navigate for any youngster who works in a shopping mall, whether that be a fitness center or Starbucks or a shop. I mean, you're constantly surrounded by products that you might not have access to in monetary terms. I always say that those people who work at Starbucks wouldn't necessarily choose to have a Starbucks beverage if they weren't working there, because if you make about 15,000 rupees per month or a little higher, this is not enough to indulge in Starbucks beverages. If on top of that you need to pay rent, groceries, etc., these are very menial, very low salaries that really don't differ that much from what a taxi driver might be making. So a lot of people, of course, still live at home and see this as an investment in the future, which at some point will pay off. And that is a gamble. And that is something that is a very real risk also, though. It's not so much a risk, it's kind of a strategy. It's of course a very different group when you compare them to new entrants to IT professional ranks, who even when I looked into this 15 years ago would at least start at 40,000 and now will easily make 1 lakh or maybe 2 lakhs. So it's quite a different group. And this is also where you see a huge contrast in middle class lifestyles and possibilities. Obviously, the economics do matter also in these jobs.
Absolutely. I think, as you say about these IT, professionals and the rising growth of individuals who are within the IT sector, it also makes me think about how the middle class was perceived during the 90s and post the 90s. And today, again, we see a third wave, I would say, of the middle class being perceived, or the definition of the middle class, changing. In the 90s, it was more of the compromising identity that the middle class was willing to have. They were okay with settling for less. It was more of the survival instinct which existed. Post the 90s, of course, there was a hunger to grow, a hunger to belong, a hunger to move up the ladder quickly and much faster. Today, I think this is to some extent, I would say my personal view as well. Today, even the first generation of middle class entrants, even they come with a certain level of confidence in themselves. Yeah. They come with a certain level of, pride in themselves. And though they don't mind, for example, they may not mind settling for a little less of the monetary compensation that they get. But when it comes to, say respect or acceptance or identity, they probably want to be treated at par with the others who are there working with them, perhaps, let's say in a Starbucks or any other cafe barista where they are there. Yeah. So what if I come from a smaller town? I'm here at my own merit. I think that's the kind of confidence that this new middle class oozes out today. Would you agree? Or would you have something to say there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the notion of merit is crucial in all of this. And I would argue that actually it was popularized by IT companies who sought a way out of this predicament where people were mainly recruited based on family reasons, community, caste, affiliations, etc. So one thing I noticed around 2003, that companies like Infosys and Tata very specifically oriented themselves towards recruitment that was merit-based. Of course, they didn't necessarily mean that it broke through caste boundaries per se. If you look at the work of Carol Upadhyay, for instance, in Bangalore, has also underlined this, is that it's still very much an upper caste environment that people operate in. And as I've also argued elsewhere, this also made it slightly easier to say that caste doesn't matter, because it was typically something one would argue within an upper caste environment. So caste, in that sense, remains an element in this as well. But one thing we see now is that influenced by social media, by other avenues of learning, of incorporating notions of style and dress, and even practicing English. Like one of the informants in my book, in the final chapter, Selvan, learned and speaks fluent English, almost accentless English, and he's learned that entirely by watching movies on YouTube. Obviously, things have changed. So if you find a way to do that and sort of carry that with a certain confidence, then you can make it in India. That is definitely true. That doesn't mean that upper middle class Indians are not on their guard for this kind of behavior. So one thing that I describe in the book as well is this kind of sort of guarding boundaries, who is admitted within those ranks. And one example I give, I think in the second chapter, where I talk about my long-term fieldwork within a small neighborhood gym in the south of Delhi, there was one female informant who was quite well aware of my research, because she'd also followed my work. She'd read about me in a newspaper, and at some point she told me, she said, I really know what you're after, what you're interested in, because I see so many of these trainers mimicking middle-class behavior. And I thought, this is interesting, because the word mimicking already indicates that she wasn't a complete believer. She wasn't convinced us yet. And this is where the real struggle lies. So there's a lot of ways that you can muscle your way up. You can use your capital, your bravoure, your comportment. But people do, and this is, I think, very specific about India. People are very aware of where everybody belongs. The other day, a friend of mine asked, what for you is it? And I'm obviously a white guy, Firang, I'm not Indian. And I said, well, one thing in India that I always encounter is people asking me my good name, my real name, my full name, which is part also of social mapping. The moment you know somebody's last name in India, you can probably decide, well, he might belong to that kind of caste background, that kind of class background. So there's a way of mapping going on. And that's what everybody does constantly in India. It's figuring out where everybody else belongs. So if you want to break through that, as we say in Dutch, you need to come of a very good home. You need to really work your way around it. Yeah.
So I think, I guess there are two ways of doing it. Either you already have a space that you come from, or you muscle your way up and make your space. Yeah. I think India offers you both the possibilities, and maybe that's the diversity of this country as well.
Well, the diversity itself is, of course, an important element in discussing any of these topics. I mean, considering that India has now 1.3 billion inhabitants, maybe 1.4, obviously nothing about India is not diverse, not its cities, not its towns, not its smallest villages. There is no homogeneity in anything. Its history is incredibly complex and goes back not just thousands of years, but within all these years is diverse. And so the moment you try to say anything about India, and I'm always very aware that I'm an outsider here, is that you need to recognize that there is there is this kind of complexity. I mean, saying anything, even my rather audacious title of Muscular India already points at that, right? I mean, how boisterous and arrogant of me to say that this is what Muscular India is.
I think observations are always interesting to look at. And on that note, I think we have spoken a lot about the aspiring middle class, the kind of jobs that they look for, or the kind of expectations that they have from the jobs and the employment opportunities. Kind of moving a little bit to another side, as you have keenly observed India and Indians and their behavior, I want to slightly move into the consumer side of it now. What I particularly found interesting in one of your short articles, which was titled as Only in India, where you have captured certain dialogues and habits of the Indian population. For example, the use of the word only itself.
Yes.
Right? And somewhere I could also connect that to the book which Rama Bijapurkar has written, which is also titled We Are Like That Only.
Yes.
Now, what other habits have you noticed, or would you like to say something on the behaviors and the differences and habits between different classes or different people in India? Something on those lines.
So it's important to note that actually this article was born out of an endeavor to capture the specificities of Indians' use of the English language. And being Dutch myself and not being fluent, I mean, this is not my mother tongue. My mother tongue is Dutch. It kind of, I love this project because I know that there's such a desire to pinpoint what actual English is. And the English are, of course, the guardians, the custodians there. But meanwhile, you have India itself, which has, as a colonial hangover, gotten stuck by the lingua franca of English, which virtually any Indian within India has some working knowledge on. But of course, this comes with a certain flexibility, and that flexibility, I think itself is very interesting to understand dynamics within India, because people use the language in a certain way that speaks to where they come from. So the piece I wrote, Only in India, kind of builds upon that book. Also, like We're Like That Only, especially kind of the way only usually exists at the end of the sandwich and seems to point at something unique. And I think that also means that when we examine these kind of dynamics, these kind of processes that fuel this middle class expansion, we need to acknowledge the specificities of it, the locally specificities of it, the way people themselves use these categories. So in that sense, I think it's a small article, but it kind of sort of points or forces us to think, it forced me at least to think about what precisely is middle class and what does it look like and how do people relate to it, and this might interest some of the people who are listening now. Also, what kind of consumer behavior emerges out of this? One thing we often see with foreign companies, for instance, is that they think like, oh, we have 300 million Indians who are middle class consumers, let's market our products to them, and then that fails abysmally. And we all know the examples from McDonald's or KFC thinking that they could get away with an internationalized menu, which no longer exists at all, to all these other examples where that fails, because simply they thought that this is a group of people who are globalized, in tune exactly with what everybody else wants out of life. And companies, of course, learned the hard lesson there. So only in India, it's also partly about acknowledging all that even if there may be 1.3 billion Indians, you need to understand that things are very specific at a ground level. And the only way to make anything a success as a company is to develop a firm knowledge of that.
Absolutely. Any other observations? Because you mentioned about the brands which have come into India, and some have succeeded, but not all of them have succeeded to the extent that they had thought they would. So what is the secret that the successful brands have taken into consideration, and that's why they have done well? And also we have brands which initially did not do too well, but it was only when they keenly observed this country and its characteristics that they were gradually able to pick up there. For example, you mentioned McDonald's.
Yeah.
So are there other such observations as well?
I think what we see now is a maturing into understanding that India itself is its own unique market, and that Indians are generally not too interested in things that are popular elsewhere simply for the idea that they're popular elsewhere. That might have worked for a while among certain affluent middle-class consumer groups in the 1990s, certainly post-1991. But has long stopped being. And one can see actually an example, Starbucks. When I started doing fieldwork among Starbucks, the menu was still very catered towards an Indian consumer who was already familiar with the brand abroad. So these were the kind of consumers who would come in and who would understand what an espresso or a cappuccino tasted like. These kind of projects, if you observe closely, have disappeared from the Starbucks menu, similar to the products like the croissants with salmon and cheese. All of that has gradually been replaced by either more vegetarian-oriented options or more spicy options. McDonald's has done the same. I mean, everything at the McDonald's menu is now incredibly spicy compared to any McDonald's you might want to visit around the world, because Indian consumers were just not that interested in that patty and that taste, because it lacks spice, it lacks certain something that an average Indian consumer would find appealing. So when the novelty wears off, if you want to sustain your brand and your presence in India, obviously you need to be in tune what people would rather have. But the interesting thing about Starbucks is also how initially they try to figure out their place and position in India in a very interactive way. So when I interviewed Starbucks baristas, they would often approach me with the idea of tasting coffee, and this was in Delhi. So they would come to me and, sir, we have this new Java brew or this brew from Colombia. Would you like to try it with us? The idea was that way Starbucks would introduce new coffee taste to the Indian consumer, but it wasn't actually about that at all. It was mainly about making sure that the baristas themselves understood what coffee was, because within the North Indian context, people generally don't drink coffee. In South India, it's a little easier with filter coffee, but there is nobody drinks this kind of bitter coffee. And they would often also ask me, sir, how can you drink this coffee bitter? I'm used to drinking coffee black without sugar and milk, and this didn't work at all. So you saw Starbucks specifically being very busy figuring out how they could position that brand. 5 years, 6 years down the line, you see that a lot of their products are actually far more now geared towards Indian consumers' taste. So they've let go of these ambitions of introducing coffee to North Indians. So it's far more oriented to tea-like beverages with sugar, with cold beverages, etc. So I think that's part of kind of sort of developments that you see international companies go through. And in that sense, India itself has become a much more serious market where the initial rather arrogant expectations have been let go of.
Right. So I think that in marketing terminology, we say standardization versus customization. I think India is one market where you definitely need a lot more customization than a standard offer being made across the board.
Well, obviously, how can you not, considering the size of the Indian market and the number of Indians? I mean, the arrogance of previous endeavors is rather actually jarring when you think of it. The whole idea that you would come up with a particular concept and you would imagine it to work in a country the size of India with its population.
Right. And in fact, even within states or within union territories of the country, the same brand has to operate very, very differently. Like, for example, the state of Gujarat, which we are in at the moment, and which I think you have also been talking about during the conversation today. A lot of the menu items, let's say, in the state of Gujarat are very different, even with McDonald's, compared to them being offered in, say, in Delhi or the Northern Capital region and so on. So, and obviously, Gujarat is a dry state, so that itself
absolutely, vegetarianism is one of them. Vegetarian mindset. If you compare Gujarat to Tamil Nadu, there are far more vegetarians in Gujarat than there in Tamil Nadu. An interesting example here is not so much McDonald's, but Burger King, which was a much later entry into the Indian market. And which really, because they rely so heavily on the idea of beef, had to come up with a product that emulated both taste, but at the same time appealed to an Indian consumer, where obviously you can't sell beef because that wouldn't work. So you need to, so they came up with the chicken versus mutton solution. And I saw them come in, and I thought it was very fascinating how they try to, from the very start, listen to what an Indian consumer might want instead of simply introducing an international product which they hope would take off.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you have any specific recommendations to brands which want to enter into India and particularly look at the middle class that you are studying so actively? If brands want to look at the middle class and want to target them, where we know that there are classes within this class as well, what is it that these brands should really take care of? Or how should they know more about this class and class within the classes of this population?
I think crucial, I mean, I'm obviously not, I'm sitting here as an anthropologist, but I do know a thing about management and marketing. I think crucial is listening and taking your time to appreciate what people tell you. And for that, you need to, from the very start, engage with your actual consumers, and you need to give them, you need to sort of ask them what it is they're looking for. So don't forget, even new entrants to middle-class ranks are active online and are exposed to international brands. But the way people relate to brands and brands' ideas is always from a local perspective. Nobody thinks, oh, wow, this is popular in California. Now I need to incorporate that into my own life. A young Indian, I've never met a young Indian who was keen on that. Now a young Indian will be thinking, what precisely can I do with this in my own life, which is in, for instance, a local Tamil Nadu context. There's, for instance, a wonderful study by an anthropologist who looked into notions of style within Tamil Nadu and how people engage with brands and clothing from the perspective of living in a small college town or a college environment, whether that be Chennai or Madurai. These studies by anthropologists are actually incredibly insightful for understanding how people relate to notions of cosmopolitanism, and which brands often mistake for thinking that it's an aspiration that clearly puts them in conversation with people around the world. This is not how people think. People live in Madurai and think like, well, you know, I need to exist in this place. I need to stand out in this place. This is something that tells something about me in this place. So for that, you need to talk to people. And I think their anthropological tools are very useful, because one thing that we're taught to do as anthropologists is listen endlessly, patiently, and again. And like my book built over a 10-year period, I can't imagine that a company would do that, but it is very helpful. It is very helpful to just let people speak without this idea that you already want to set the agenda.
Right. I think it's particularly the two words that you have mentioned here. One is letting the people speak, and second, listening. I think these are really crucial. And particularly if we think about the brands which have done well in India, they do this all the time. Let's say, for example, Procter & Gamble, one which I keenly study at my end as well. They are constantly into researching what is it that's changing with the Indian consumer now, whether it is in terms of their usage habits, their behavioral patterns, their social dimensions that are changing, their hunger for different things, whether it is material or non-material things. And somewhere that's where they, and then of course the trial of the products and so on.
Yeah.
So, but I think this continuous listening to your audience, it has to be, or to your target customer, has to be an ongoing process. It cannot be a 1 month or a 1 year process.
That's why I also think, like, if you want to do anything in India, you need to rely on a local team that will be able to give you that kind of input, and to which you listen. simply like, oh, this is how people engage with this brand or this idea or this product, and this is how it complements their lives. This is how it elevates them, and this is something that you need to have a certain patience for, that companies are not always willing to commit to.
Right. I think somewhere, particularly for the brands which have done well, from my own observations, it also comes out in the way they communicate with the target set of customers. So for the same product or for the same service, they may have more than one marketing campaign running, simply for the simple reason that they are catering the same product, but it is able to cater to two different sets of customers, and they both need to be talked to differently. So I think that's where listening really comes into the picture, and that too listening continuously. And I guess today, thanks to technology, it's also possible to listen and observe your customers. Of course, having a local presence is certainly important. Having local partners is certainly important. That's where these brands, they also have the local offices or the local franchise partners who actually gives them the inputs or give them the market insights on what's happening at the ground level. But I would also think that technology has given the possibility to observe where is the tide going for the consumers. What is it that they are watching? What is it that they are thinking? What is it that they are communicating? Through the communication that they make online on the various social media platforms. So many brands, I think today also indulge in this social listening, because a large part of the young middle population, the young middle class population, is so actively onto these social media platforms that if you actually do a proper analysis of what they are talking about, we can know a lot about them. A lot of observations can be possible there as well. I just one more question before we move on to, I see a couple of interesting questions from our audience as well. How can brands make a successful pitch? Just two words from your side, for brands, apart from say research. If we talk from the marketing point of view, apart from knowing the customers, what else can they do? Is it about change, because changing the product may not be possible very frequently. But then what is the other aspect that the brand can focus on when they want to cater to an Indian customer or an Indian middle class, especially for these kind of businesses that you have looked at, say the fitness trainers or the baristas and so on?
Well, I think one thing that you see international companies have done is they go through a certain development here. So they start out with one, and then they do, by learning, by getting customer feedback, they've changed their menu. And if you look at McDonald's and at Starbucks, they're two really clear examples of companies that if you look at their starting menu, that doesn't exist anymore at all. It has completely changed.
Correct.
I think one of the crucial things is, and this really makes, this presents us with a kind of sort of different setup from post-1991, the kind of liberalizations of the Indian economy in 1997, India's 50 years of independence, that whole phase when companies would flock to India with new products, thinking that Indian consumers would like them. I think the crucial thing that has really changed is this maturing of the Indian consumer itself. So Indians are much more confident in speaking out what they are interested in. And of course, this coalesces a little bit with the size and growth of the Indian middle class itself, where people are also well aware that our numbers are significant. But don't forget, I mean, we often talk about foreign companies, but by now, Indian companies themselves have taken the world stage in terms of setting the tone. Here in the Netherlands, for instance, our largest steel factories are all operated by Tata. Jaguar as a car is owned by an Indian company. So we could very well reverse the question, like what is the footprint, the imprint of Indian companies around the world? Some of them are among the largest on the planet. So obviously what we do historically as marketing management historians, which I'm not even, but as an anthropologist, I do read books like We're Like That Only, is that we're still sort of in this phase of thinking like India is developing internally, but we also need to think about how India is developing globally. India's footprint is enormous. Its popularity of its, for instance, of its TV shows is enormous the world over. It's not just Bollywood anymore. It's also its production of TV shows like Sacred Games or otherwise. So, and obviously, I mean, we have Netflix here. Its European headquarters are in Amsterdam, but obviously a sizable amount of the production that Netflix is involved in is actually situated in India. So the tables in that sense are also really turning. And I think increasingly as scholars, we need to start looking into, you know, how India itself exports ideas and products and makes an impression locally onto very small countries like my own, the Netherlands.
Yeah. I think that's a very, very interesting point you have brought forward, Michiel. And as I was during our conversation when we were talking about Starbucks, this thought had crossed my mind as well, that on one side we're talking about how, for example, the menu is being adapted here for the Indian population. But if we really look at the Starbucks and the items available overseas, for example, there is an item called as the Indian masala chai in the Starbucks menu as well now. You know, so that's where India and Indians indeed are leaving their footprints all across the globe, and definitely I think
India's everywhere, from yoga to chai to back again, but also in very real production of cars, in steel industries, from Tata to what's his name? I'm thinking of the other name right now. Tata on the one hand, and then Ambani, and so all these industrial houses are phenomenally impactful around the world over. And don't forget also the leadership of Indian professionals at companies like Apple, Google, etc. So the days are over where all of this was looking at India. India has long been looking at the world, and in that sense, I think it's far more productive to think of India alongside China as leaving an incredibly important global imprint outside India.
Outside the country, absolutely. I think there was a time when India was called as the country of the snake charmers. I think today that those days are probably gone. And we are a country which is here to charm, and across the classes, we are a country which is here to charm the world. And with its own talents, with its own abilities, and professional attitude.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think we have, on that note, we have some very interesting questions here for us in the chat box. So let me just start with the very first one that we have here. This question is from Rajendra Sharma. He says, as an anthropologist, what is your advice to the marketers for sense making on marketing to the Indian middle class during the next normal? I think you have answered part of it, but I think what he's intending to ask is, now once we are beyond this pandemic and when things will be handled a little differently than they were handled before the pandemic, what should the brands do now to cater to India?
Obviously, the first and foremost is to look into what is happening at home, not just cooking and living at home, but working at home. We're already seeing this change in terms of fitness training. So fitness training in the last 9 months has made a remarkable shift from gyms to home training. So people actually, the fitness trainers that I used to, and I was just actually right before we started talking, I had a conversation with one of my lead informants from Bangalore. And he's recently left the company that he was always working for and is now offering home training. This is an enormous development. So what we're going to see, and I think this also relates to environmental concerns, is, and this of course planet-wise, not just India, but the idea of working from home. Living at home, not just living at home, but working from home, doing all sorts of things at home. And in the past, what we saw, for instance, was high-end brands doing this to a certain degree. So those working in the field, for instance, of Louis Vuitton and Gucci know that offering your clothes door to door for Gucci and Louis Vuitton in Haryana was already a big thing. Same with Rajasthan, etc. But we're going to see more and more of that. Home deliveries, things being catered towards the home. So no longer people actually venturing out to a shopping mall, but actually bringing all that in. And I think that's where we're going to see one of the sort of crucial developments, not just because of the pandemic and people being scared of contracting something, but also people realizing that, you know, if you don't need to be stuck in traffic all the time, you gain so much time. It's much easier to have a brand to come to your home than the other way around.
Right.
So I think we're going to see huge shifts in thinking here.
Right. Yeah, I think it is. If I were to summarize what you have just tried to say, it is about adapting to the way the new consumer will probably be living his or her life now.
Yes.
Which is going to be. I mean, there are also marketing reports on consumer behavior or the changing behavior of the Gen Z and the generations going forward. There's going to be a tendency of cocooning, you know,
Yes.
staying in or staying indoors as much as possible. People will socialize, but I think socializing is going to be done differently now than what was done before. And brands which adapt to this change or this change of behavior and change of expectations, I think that's what is really going to matter.
Yes.
And I think here at India, we're already in fact witnessing that in the last few months. For example, home delivery of products, or as you have also pointed out, the gym services having their own mobile applications, let's say, and people actually doing gymming at home, although they are doing it in groups, you know, or on maybe online platforms like we are here together on Zoom at the moment. So people actually doing their morning workouts, morning yogas through an application, through a trainer, but it's all happening online. So
the most successful guys that I interviewed and incorporated in this book have already kind of made that transition where they're combining home training with online training and outdoor training. But it's really moved out of the physical gyms because obviously they were closed for the longest time, but people are also realizing like, I don't need to go to that gym to get the same result. I can do part of it at home. Once a week, I'll meet my trainer in a park nearby. And meanwhile, I'll sort of figure it out. And online technologies have been so fundamental to this. I mean, the whole way we're doing things now through Zoom is an example of that.
Absolutely. There's a comment from Professor Pallavi Vyas. She's our colleague here. First of all, she says, congratulations for such a fascinating study, Michiel. And what Pallavi also says, there are few barriers to entry into the fitness industry. Young men take a short course and become gym instructors. Her concern, Pallavi's concern is with a surge in supply, is the demand for their services adequate to warrant higher wages to allow this group to jump from the lower middle class into the middle class? So is, you know, supply being higher than demand? Do you feel so?
Yeah. So well, we haven't really talked about this yet. Is that the fitness industry itself has diversified into not just providing training to affluent customers and clients, but also providing training courses themselves to fitness trainers wanting to enter the branch of fitness work. So certification courses are a huge industry in India right now. Gold's Gym and other brands all have their own academies offering courses where they kind of train trainers to become trainers. It sounds really dubious when I formulate it this way. Obviously, it takes a little bit more to become successful. And this is where the notion of learning comes in, and actually utilizing the profession itself as a way to augment your skills and your knowledge of what it takes to be middle class. So one thing I found is that the most successful fitness trainers are typically the people who use these early days as a way of learning and not so much as a way of simply making an income. Those who merely think of it as an income, especially when they're floor trainers working for 15,000 rupees per month, generally don't make it big. It's usually the guys who really figure out a way to capitalize on the situation itself.
Okay. So are you somewhere indicating that it's going to be a survival of the fittest? even in the
Yes,
fitness industry.
but it always is. It is like that in any profession. You can't all become like one of the central characters in my book, who's there in two different chapters, works in Chennai and used to be a former IT professional. We can't all be like him, but that's also because he's very specifically invested in developing new workout routines.
Right.
He knows how to level with his customers. He knows how to bank on his own bodily capital as a very successful bodybuilder. So he's been able to make that work. But there are quite a few, especially in the second chapter, where I talk about my work within a small neighborhood gym. The men who work there haven't all turned out to be success stories, and some of them have actually moved on and are really no longer working as fitness trainers. Obviously, not for all of them, the sky is the limit. Quite a few of them drop out and will start doing something else, but that's life, right? I mean, that goes for most of us. That even goes for us academics. Not all of us become professors. And not all of us write highly successful books. So yeah.
True. There's in connection with what you have just mentioned, there's also a comment from Puneet that you repeatedly mentioned that you focused on men while doing your research on fitness trainers in South Delhi. Was it a conscious choice made by you that you will only focus on this category? Were you unable to meet any coaches who were also from the women gender? Why did you focus only on this set of respondents?
Yeah, I think this is an incredibly important question. Thank you for that. I mean, when I started this work, the field was overwhelmingly dominated by men. And when it came to bodybuilding, which was a side interest of mine in India, these are almost entirely men. There were no women involved, also no women in the organization, etc. This has obviously changed quite a bit. So also within bodybuilding, there's a huge growth in female bodybuilding competitions. There are huge number of female trainers at gyms. But when I started doing this, that wasn't the case. So it felt more natural to just focus on men. And part of that also had to do with that I was interested in how these young men were relating to questions of masculinity and otherwise. So it was also partly fueled by that specific interest on how these men were relating to themselves being men among men, also relating to the bigger questions. You'll recall that the last few years, India has had some big discussions on what it means to be a male in India, and men have often seen themselves as being vilified in relation to really the most extreme rape cases imaginable. So it was part also a fascination that I had. It was like, how do men relate to themselves being young men? How do they move out of patriarchy? One of the things that I note in the book as well is that a lot of these men are typically the kind of persons who've had to rethink a lot of things in life, coming from lower middle class families, coming from rather conservative backgrounds, but doing something so fundamentally different that every aspect of their life and beliefs had to be retaught. And for me, that was very insightful also in giving me a different impression of how men might think about very crucial topics in Indian society.
This is just my own question. As you mentioned this, do you feel, is it because India is still a masculine society that somewhere this became an important set of respondents to look at, or you don't think so?
I wonder if it ever was, considering modern India itself, and the phenomenal impact of women on India's history. I mean, don't forget, people always come up with these ideas of a conservative society, but the Netherlands never had a female prime minister. I know a lot of people dislike Indira Gandhi, but her impact on India was enormous. The same goes with scholarship, with scientists, with influences from Tamil Nadu to other states. So I think this kind of what we. So I always caution people a little bit into falling into the trap of using these extremely disconcerting and revolting instances as indicative of how Indians might be thinking about gender, I think things are more subtle than that. A lot of the trainers that I interviewed were equally concerned about the freedom their sisters, their mothers, their friends had, their female colleagues, in terms of crossing the street, being out in the open, doing their own thing. And I think if there is one thing that characterizes my research over time is that I've only really met men who were equally concerned about this and who were equally in tune with the fact that they had female colleagues, that they had mothers who had had careers, sisters who had had ambitions. So I try to move a little bit away from that and try to also highlight that within India, there's a very stark, very clear tradition to talk about these things, to face that head on. And in that sense, I think, yes, patriarchy on the one hand, but on the other hand, also phenomenal dialogue and conversation about all of this. And this only goes to show, if you look at India's history and its phenomenal female leaders, there's never not been a time when women didn't speak out and weren't actually necessarily silenced. So I always thought of India as an inspiration that way.
Yeah, no, I think I absolutely agree with that. And if we really look at the kind of work which is being done by Indian women, but it does not get counted in the workforce or the workforce contribution, it is enormous. Yeah. I think the numbers would be very, very different if that category was also taken into consideration. There's a very interesting question and comment from Professor Jimol Uni, which is again connected partly to what we all are doing at the moment, which is work from home, and also with the women workforce and women work participation. So Jimol says there is a debate on whether this work from home norm will increase women work participation. Do you think Indian middle class women will be able to make inroads in the labor market in this phase of the economy, including as maybe say gym yoga trainers?
See, I'm not really, I don't know enough about this. So I'm not a scholar who's working on this. One thing I can imagine though is, and I'm really looking at, sort of evidence from my friends, female friends, who's saying that, well, the moment you take the need to go to the office out of the equation, you no longer have to engage with taxi drivers or the very real dangers of being exposed late at night, and you could do your work at home. It becomes easier. So yes, maybe, but I think the whole question also builds a little too strongly on the idea that what is stopping middle class educated women right now from working is the fact that they are shackled at home somehow. So I think we need to interrogate that a little bit more, if that is really the case, or there are other factors at play that might sort of allow us to be a bit more critical about what this is about, what keeps certain women at home, not working, not living to their full potential, whereas others do find a way to make their way outside. And I think the sort of that analysis really needs to focus on economics as well as social and cultural factors.
Yeah, I think this, I would agree with that, but I also think that the fact that all of us, a large part of us are now exposed and comfortable with the fact that you can actually do a lot of work from home, elements or tasks which were otherwise not imagined to be possible to do from home.
Yeah.
I think this pandemic has brought us that experience that no, it is possible. And particularly for the women workforce that wants to experience and explore doing things beyond just the home boundaries. Personally, I think this is definitely going to offer a lot of opportunities going forward.
Perhaps
because we do see a rise in work from home possibilities across different industries, whether it is in say transcription, whether it is in the the yoga, or in some of the arts activities, or in teaching, or in research. So many other aspects also because of this work from home possibility. I think it's definitely going to give rise to this. How about yes?
Okay,
did
sorry.
you say something?
You can go ahead. Otherwise,
all right. So I'll just take one more from Amol and then let you come in. There's a question from Professor Amol. Amol says, "How about middle class in other countries? Is middle class very different from the middle class in India?" I think this is an interesting point to touch upon.
I think a lot of the things that I've been trying to point out about inter-middle class mobility also apply to other countries such as the Netherlands. I myself, for instance, hail from a lower middle class background where my father and mother never went to college. My father grew cauliflower all his life. My mother was an administrative worker. Belonging to the middle class themselves, which is not a very strong concept in the Netherlands, was something they had to get used to. So I think a lot of, at heart, some of these concepts are definitely we can employ to any conversation about becoming as countries develop economically. When we see newcomers challenge the exalted position that oldcomers have taken up in. One of the things I show in my book is also that when it comes to India, the upper middle class itself, which we now look at as the original middle class, has never been quite accepted as the original middle class. There's always been a successive number of developments which have proposed a new group as the newcomers and another group as the oldcomers. And one thing that you see is that across the decades, the oldcomers were at some point the newcomers and were criticized for very much the same things as the newcomers these days are. And I think that is something we see across the world. You see that in formulations of new wealth and the new rich, and where people always think like, oh, these groups don't really know what it is in terms of, how to behave, etc. So I think, yeah, there is definitely scope for comparison. I think what makes the Indian case unique is probably numbers, the sheer number of it, but also the central place that the discussion of the middle class takes up in politics and in socioeconomics. So the middle class is always there as actually a conceptual group or idea that either means votes or consumer spending power or behavior that we frown upon. And I think that's specifically what makes the Indian case very relevant and interesting, and also quite different. For instance, if you compare that to China, which in its own trajectory has tried to do away with the notion of class altogether. So the moment you start speaking of the Chinese middle class, there's already a red flag thinking like, yeah, but didn't China to do away with this whole notion of class in general? So I think in many ways, and we see that a lot in anthropology, India has always been compared to China that way. I think actually what works better is the comparison, for instance, between India and Brazil, oddly, in terms of trajectories. But when it comes to the middle class, yeah, there are fascinating studies currently on the middle class in South Africa, for instance. And I think there actually you see the scope for comparison.
Right. So are they different? Are they more the middle class, say in South Africa, as you just pointed out, compared to the middle class here in India? Or
a lot of the discussions are similar in terms of concerns over overconsumption, the political strength of the middle class. A lot of that is comparable, but obviously all of these groups emerge out of their own trajectories, out of their own country's own trajectories. And obviously, in that sense, India is unique compared to South Africa or Brazil, but there are similarities that work. And I've often suggested that Brazil, in that sense, is a very interesting partner for comparison in terms of size, population, relation to media, perhaps more so than China, which is always the likely candidate to compare India to, but which often falls flat because the differences are so stark and so clear-cut.
Right. All right. Sudhir, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, we are just approaching our time limit, so I would request you to be there for the next 2-3 more minutes just to extend it. There are two very interesting questions. One is by colleague Sarthak Bakshi, who teaches at the School of Arts and Sciences.
Yes.
And he's saying that...
How's Sarthak?
Yeah, he's fine, he's well. So he's asking that the particular class of body that you're talking about, who is breaking into the urban gymming industry and nightclubs and others, they relatively come from the rural families who are actually middle class in their rural villages.
Yeah.
And he says that the divide is more into rural to urban rather than a class divide, which is from a kind of lower to middle. So this mobility is less of upward mobility in the terms of class and more
Mm.
of mobility from rural to urban, because they are middle class there and they come and they want to become urban middle class of a different kind. So what is your
Yeah.
take on this?
Yeah, I think so. Similarly, as I try to upset the differences between lower and upper middle class, I also try to upset and interrogate the inherent idea of a difference between rural and urban, especially my chapters on Delhi. I try to really focus on, so what does that actually mean? A lot of the rural families, or that you might think of as rural in NCR, aren't really that at all. I mean, they're literally, their entire existence is in relation to the city, the fast growing city. So the people I focus on are in that sense transitioning from semi-rural to semi-urban. So we need to be critical of that very assumption itself, that these are people coming from villages. You know, the one fascinating thing with India is that villages are often bigger than cities in the West. So before you know it, you've labeled something a village with 100,000 inhabitants. That is actually having a direct train connection to the bigger metropolis. So I try to question that a little bit. Like, what does it mean to be from a particular urban background? I see Sartak has just joined us there on camera, which is, and I love that question because there's so much to be said about this topic about,
Yes.
you know.
No, I mean, I was just mentioning this semi-urban also because this is, I mean, I was mentioning it as peri-urban because this is also
Peri-urban,
post-liberalization.
yes.
The development has really encroached and reached the villages, in the margin, typically in the NCR area.
Yeah.
So this is exactly, I mean, this is a very complex kind of a rural-urban dynamics also.
And
So
this
I
is one
agree
of
with
the things that I, Satak will recall because you were there a few years ago that we had a conference in Bihar, in Patna, actually on these developments.
Yes.
Is that, and I presented a paper there which was about youngsters from Patna itself who are working in the fitness industry in Patna. And the way they relate to these identities is quite complex, actually. On the one hand, from a Delhi perspective, Patna is a world away, is a regional city beset by its own kind of problem. Within the context of Bihar, Patna is obviously a breath of fresh air, the city that people migrate to. So from an anthropological point of view, this is always what we try to do, right? We try to follow these individual stories and we try to understand how people relate to these kind of categories themselves. How do they employ that in their own life strategies and how do they make it their own?
Thank you. Yes, of course. And your work is pushing towards thinking us to think towards these lines. So thank you for that. Yeah.
And thanks for joining, Satak. Good to see you again.
Same here. Same here.
Sudhir, would you want to take one more question and then we can?
Yeah, this is the last question and then we'll end. And it might take 2 more minutes of yours. This is a
No
question, very
worries.
interesting question by Madhumita Mazumdar. And she's asking that the term, the cultural capital that you use as a way to enter the middle class in India, in America, it is defined by mass consumption. And in Europe, it is bequeathed by the older middle class. So what cultural capital do new aspirants in Indian middle class use?
So my use of cultural capital deviates a little bit from the more classical ways of using it in that, so I differentiate between social and cultural capital. In social capital mainly being about context, feeling at ease within a social environment, whereas I use cultural capital also as a way to interrogate what it means to be doing something differently. So to move across cultures. So these can be cultural differences in terms of where you belong, but also very much in terms of the kind of work you do. So a lot of these men that I've interviewed are doing something radically different from where they come from, what their parents or their uncles or their friends are used to doing. So that I conceptualize as cultural mobility, as, sort of moving, navigating different cultural possibilities. But I realize that these are kind of sort of ways of thinking about change that are also cursory, where I sketch a certain predicament. So I mainly use them to think about something, not necessarily the way Foucault or Bourdieu would have used them. I think by now, when it comes to social and cultural capital, we kind of know what it entails. But cultural capital might not only be the kind of books that Bijal has behind her there on screen, the way Bourdieu envisioned it. It might also be the kind of flexibility you have or the kind of guts you have to change cultural realms, to do something radically different, to be your own person, to not follow in your father's footsteps. So in the book, I use them in a somewhat different way from the usual way that you might use them in the US, because I find it captures the predicament of these young men better in an Indian context than they would in the more traditional way if I'd looked into the same topic in the US.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michiel, for doing this. Professor Bijal, if you want to
I
say
think
something.
it's very true. Just kind of picking up from the last sentence that Michiel had given, it's all about creating your own identity. It's all about creating your own presence, irrespective of whichever part of the world you are in. Whether you are an Indian who is migrating from a rural area to an urban area to belong to a certain middle class, or an urban middle class person migrating to maybe somewhere outside of India and trying to make a different setting, a different place for himself or herself outside. So I think it's been a very, very interesting conversation we have had with you today, Michiel. The new Indian middle class, from what I have picked up from our conversation today, is it is no more just a political entity. The word class, I think in today's times, it's no more related to politics alone. The Indian middle class today is a cultural, a social, and an economic entity, which has a lot of expectations, and at the same time, this class also has a lot to offer to the world. I think that this conversation is definitely going to lead to a lot of more research, a lot of more questions that all of us are going to try and answer through this. And many of us look forward to stay in touch with you.
Yes, please do.
From Ahmedabad University as well.
Thank you so much, Michiel, for doing this. Because I think in management school it is really needed, because here people talk about only consumers. Once they start talking about middle class, I think that will change the entire discussion in the classroom. So this was really important, and thank you so much for doing this. I'm grateful to you. We are grateful to you, and we would love to invite you again for some other opportunity. I'm thankful to all the participants and the colleagues who join all the time and they ask very interesting questions. And thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, Professor Bijal, for doing this so nicely.
Thank you, Bijal.
Thank
Fantastic.
You, thank you, Michiel.
Yeah, I love that.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care and see you next Saturday.
Wishing you all a wonderful Saturday and hope to meet you all in real life at some point. Yes. Stay safe.